Would you pray with me? Now, Lord God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. In Jesus' name, amen. When I was a young woman, I ran across for the first time some pictures of my grandmother when she was very young. My grandfather kept extensive scrapbooks, 7 or 8 of them, huge books, thick and big, with everything from pictures and letters to political buttons and newspaper articles. And it was in these scrapbooks that I found pictures of my grandmother. I knew her who was someone who had been crippled by rheumatoid arthritis. She was quiet and sweet. She was incredibly intelligent, but she was muted by her life. The pictures I found of her showed someone else entirely, someone I had never met. They would have been taken somewhere around the mid-1920s when she was in her late teens and early 20s. She lived in Ohio with 6 brothers and sisters on a farm with her father and her mother and her father, who was also a Baptist minister. In these pictures, she is wearing men's plaid knickers. She has long socks and a jaunty vest and a man's driving cap. And she is grinning with the joy that is inherent to being 20. There are more pictures of her on that day. She and her friends are apparently on a hike, and at one point she has rolled down her socks. She is in groups with her sisters. She is one of the boys. What is interesting about her in all these pictures is her freedom. She seems completely uninhibited, unafraid. I don't know what would have happened to her had her mother seen those pictures, but whatever it was, Frona was not worried about it in that moment. And I love those pictures. They show me that she had joy in her life, that before her body betrayed her, she truly lived and laughed and loved broadly. The pictures would have been taken sometime between 1925 and 1928, judging by her age. And it is striking to me how much they reveal, not just about my grandmother, but about that time and about how life works. The 1920s were a loose time, a time of economic boom. And during an economic boom, several things happen. One is that the young people rebel. Extra money gives a looseness to the culture, which gives them space to look outside the lives they have had, the life their parents have had. Young people in the 1920s had survived a horrible war, the war to end all wars. They had to think that everything would be coming up roses from then on out. Another thing that happens when there is an economic boom is technological advancement, and those young people were seeing automobiles in the streets. They were beginning to see airplanes in the sky. The world was opening up in ways no one could possibly have imagined when they were born in the early years of that century. And if the 1920s were loose, the 2 decades which followed them were tight as a drum. Some of you have memories of those years. Some of you who are here now were raised during the Depression, during the years of World War II. My mother was raised in Charleston, South Carolina, where they blacked out their windows at night, where they saw troop ships empty with endless parades of ambulances full of dead and wounded men. The nature of the Great Depression and the war which followed was that very few people escaped the financial effects. Everyone knew what it was like to wonder how you would put food on the table for the next week. Everyone in the community was scraping for pennies wherever they could, trying to find shoes for the children and keep a roof over their heads at the same time. We were an entire country, an entire world, as it turns out, living in survival mode. I have learned a lot about survival mode in the last decades of my life. I have observed the effects of it on my South Sudanese friends. A mother who would not give her child his ADHD medicine because it made him not eat, it made him not feel hungry, which to her is a much greater worry than whether or not he did his homework. A father who wouldn't let his children play with the other children in the neighborhood because he does not know them. They are not Sudanese. I have seen the effects of survival mode that wasn't based on economics as well. A family caring for a child whose illness could take the child's life at any time. A family caring for a teen with mental health issues that threaten the child's life. A family walking through cancer for the third time with a beloved parent or a spouse. We're back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which you may get tired of hearing about from me as I see its effects everywhere. When we are in survival mode, it is extremely aversive. Being hungry and not knowing where food will come from is incredibly aversive and all-consuming. We think of nothing else when we are hungry. And it all works that way in survival mode. Whatever is threatening our life or the life of someone we love is all we think about. Nothing else matters. We tighten down everything to that one priority of staying alive. Survival mode is so aversive that after it is over, after the treatments worked or a job was secured or the beloved son came back from war, we never forget how horrible it was to be in that state on the edge between life and death. That is the America of the second half of the 20th century. We became a country laser-focused on risk assessment and avoidance. Insurance became an institutional truth of every life. We hedged our bets on every front possible, and anyone who could create wealth created layers of protection between themselves and survival mode. My generation of college graduates became business people and engineers, each of whom spent a lot of time learning how to keep the ceiling from falling in. There were some lawyers and some doctors and about 3 English teachers, but most of the people I knew going through college majored in business in one way or another. Remember The Graduate? Remember when he comes home and they have the welcome home party and he doesn't know what he's going to do with his life, and the man from the neighborhood sidles up to him and says, "Plastics." And while the boom economy of that particular decade allowed the optimism that he would be able to run away with his love and live life with having to resort to plastics, the truth is that the bust and the inflation of the 1970s probably put him right back on that road. I know you're waiting for me to talk about this beatitude. This one, just like all the others, is the hardest one. Jesus says, "You are blessed when people call you names and accuse you of things falsely because you've been following the face of God. You're blessed if you get hurt protecting someone, or if you get arrested working for justice, or if you lose your job because you weren't going to turn a blind eye to the abuses of the system at your place at work. You're blessed if people avoid you and make fun of you because you're putting the rules of God first, because then you'll know that you fit into the kingdom." When I was a child, I heard that story about Paul, the Apostle Paul, who was arrested and beaten, and when he was released, left the prison rejoicing. What? They beat him, and he was arrested, and he was in prison, and he's happy about it? I have learned, really just lately, that the Beatitudes are well named, although Jesus never said the word beatitude, which appears to be spelled incorrectly. They are all ways of looking at the world. They are attitudes of approach. They are priorities, a choice of one kingdom over another. This last one, the one about being persecuted, is about fitting in and about the choice that we will make, whether we make it consciously or not. Just like in high school, we will choose a lunch table. We will not be able to sit with the jocks and sit with the nerds. To sit with one group is to reject the other. If we try to sit at all the tables, bending ourselves to the rules and procedures of each different table, we will quickly become something like cream of wheat, with no flavor of our own, simply a blob which gloms onto whatever is handy. So we have to pick one. And in that one, we find acceptance and protection and love. God says, if you sit at my table, you will find it full of good food. The rules of the table are these. You take care of the table because it isn't yours. It's mine. You take care of anyone who shows up at the table because I let you sit there and it isn't your table. If you do this, everything at the table is yours. Everyone at the table becomes your sibling, and there will always be plenty for everyone who comes. God's economy is a boom economy. It is loose and expansive and allows for freedom of thought and action. If it ever seems stingy, that is us making it stingy. That is our fear of falling back into survival mode. That is our fear that God doesn't really have enough to give us all. And we probably need to hold on to our part with everything we have. When I was young, there were many heroes around, talked about in the culture all the time. There was Roger Williams, whose life and choices to stand up for religious freedom and for indigenous people were reenacted just up the road at Eagle Eyrie when I was a teenager. There was Martin Luther King Jr., who didn't have a holiday yet, but who was killed when I was 5 years old, and whose legacy began to pervade the culture throughout my childhood. There was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who became the hero of every Protestant minister in America, and whose story included both theology and action. There was the Mahatma Gandhi, who read American philosophy, led his people to freedom, and influenced Martin Luther King Jr. to lead his own people. These were brave people, heroic people, and the sense of them around me was not, be like them. It was this. Sometimes extraordinary people do extraordinary things. We don't really expect you to be like them. They're different from the rest of us. None of you children should expect to do anything like what they did. You certainly should not expect to die for a cause. You see, the culture I grew up in had just escaped from survival mode. We were all into risk avoidance. All risk could be avoided. No one has to get hurt. It's going to be great. The entire last half of the century was spent cementing the idea that there are good people and bad people, and that nothing really bad ever happens to good people because they know how to avoid the bad things. Remember, kids, you are good people, and good people do good things and get good things. Bad people do bad things because they're bad people, and bad things happen to them because that's what bad things do. And the disconnect of that has made for a very wonky, very difficult culture. A culture whose rudders have been beaten to mush. A culture playing the only card it has, which is actually a really pretty good constitution, to try and right itself. So here is the truth which I see expressed in this last, very difficult blessing. We have to pick a table. There is this line in the sand, and it is always there, and it is there for every person. There is no one who does not have the line drawn in front of them. The line goes all the way down the room, down the hall, down the street, through our offices, our schools, our hospitals, our government buildings. On one side of the line is God's table, the rules of which include respecting and loving God enough to do what God has asked of us, which is to include and care for each other. No exceptions. On the other side of the line is everything else. On the other side of the line, there is a kind of safety. We can be invisible on that side of the line. We can be bland and tasteless and mushy, fitting ourselves into whatever mold is around us and never pushing back, never getting in trouble, never making waves or being pointy in any way. We can fit in with the crowd, and if the crowd starts to do something awful, we can stand back and hold our hands up and say, but I didn't do it. I was over here. I was minding my own business. In the 1960s, we heard our life of faith expressed this way. I said to myself, sit down, you're rocking the boat. I said to myself, sit down, you're rocking the boat. And the devil will drag you under by the sharp lapel of your wicked coat. Sit down, you're rocking the boat. In the 1970s, we heard, rock the boat, don't rock the boat, baby, rock the boat, don't tip the boat over. Remember that one? My generation is the big chill generation who believed that we would change the world. And then we ran up against the need to make a living. And we settled for plastics and running shoes. I think we look at this coming generation of activists with something like loving condescension. Dear hearts, we say, it's adorable that you think you are going to change the world. Jesus, to me, is the most perfect combination of realist and idealist that I know of. He has no illusions about what's going to happen to him when he goes to Jerusalem. He avoids Jerusalem and the temple for 3 years. When he finally goes, he knows what he has to do. He knows that he cannot let the abuses of the temple stand without confronting them. He knows that they will bait him, that they will hate him. But he has thrown in his lot with the people who are being abused by the temple system, by Herod and by Rome. He crossed the line when he picked up the mantle given to him by God. That prayer he prays in Gethsemane tells so much about who he is as a person. He does not want to be arrested. He does not want to become a martyr. He does not want to suffer. But he's already crossed the line. He's been seated at the table of God all his life. And when the time came to pick a side, he picked God. And God does not permit people at the table to be abused. So when they came to arrest him, Jesus has already made his choice. He already picked a side. He says to those who accuse him, "No, this is a choice you are making. I have nothing to do with it." And when he is lynched by a government giving in to a mob, he speaks not of injustice, not about the powers that got him killed. He speaks to God, and he says, "My spirit is yours." I don't wear crosses much. I have some very pretty ones, some very meaningful ones. I'm wearing some on my ears today, so you know I'm not judging anybody who's also wearing a cross. I'm still not sure where I stand on it. I will say this: to wear a cross is to cross that line. If we would align ourselves with a man who got himself killed standing up for poor people, we would do well to consider the consequences of putting such an image around our own necks. Putting the image of such horror and such hope around our necks is crossing a line. It says, "I have chosen a table." The table isn't mine, it's God's. And so I have to obey the rules of that table. It says, I don't really weigh the risks of sitting at God's table. I knew when I sat down here that some of the people at the table were going to try to throw other people out. I'm ready to defend them, whatever that means. It says, I accept that I am sitting at a table that isn't safe. It has a price. Specifically, that I'm not going to be able to sit at any other tables. It may also have other consequences, and I am ready for them. It says, I prefer the blessings of being at this table to anything I might get from sitting somewhere else. I have chosen the table where anyone who sits down is welcome, all the way welcome, with no rules except that they too have to defend whoever sits down at the table. I have chosen the table full of good food, full of good fellowship, full of love. And I prefer that table, the table that has as its head the person of God. And I will give up whatever I have to in order to stay here. That's the deal. It's the only deal. There is no deal where we sit at that table and also sit at the other tables. There's a line between them. And while we will always be welcomed back to the table, we cannot sit at two tables at once.